Today we have four gentlemen from the Dupont company, all of whom were involved in the development and application of the Permacept separator, the Permacept membranes. On my far right, Dr. Lynn Applegate. Next to him is Jack Strantz, Tom Eckmann, and Charlie Brown.
The early days of Permacept found that most people did not understand reverse osmosis, how to build systems, and how to encounter or what pre-treatment or post-treatment was required for water systems. And so a lot of the efforts in the initial stage was to try to educate engineers, consulting engineers, and water companies about reverse osmosis, where it could be applied and where it should not be applied.
You know, the total history of the Permacept group from its inception to the day they closed the doors was how long?
Probably somewhere around 1963 or 64 in the beginning, closed its door in 2004.
So it's 40 years.
40 years.
How was the change in direction made to go from gas separation to desalination using a similar configuration of hollow fiber?
That was almost from the beginning. I think people realized very quickly that the gas separation market, or at least the helium separation market, was never going to be that large. And they said, we had the technology, spinning technology, why don't we look for other uses for this concept of hollow fiber separations? And so as almost within a year or so after it was started, we were started spinning nylon 6,6 hollow fibers. This was all done at the Kinston textile fibers plant. And but again, very low water flux rates, so there was a lot of initial work done on on post-treating these fibers, these nylon fibers, to improve the flux characteristics while still maintaining reasonable rejection.
Was the first permeator called the B1?
That was the very first permeator, was a B1 gas separation permeator designed for helium separation from natural gas.
And what sort of characteristics do those fibers have in terms of flux and salt rejection?
That was just the brackish water systems. They operated at 400 psi.
They had like
It all depends on
17% salt passage before we added our PTB.
PTA.
Our PTA, and then it would come down to like what, 7 or 8%?
10, yeah, it would be under 10.
Under 10.
The idea was just to try and get a product that had less than 500 parts per million dissolved salts in the product, operating at 400 psi.
See, at those times we made the flow rate depend on the size of the unit. We made 4-inch devices first, and then they made 8-inch devices. Then we eventually got to 10-inch devices.
Yeah.
And so each side had
There were a lot of plants in Florida in the early days, most of them built by permuted or polymetrics.
Right.
Yeah.
And it seems to me they all were around 93% salt rejection or something like that.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of it depends on that's on the sodium chloride basis.
Yeah, right.
So it all depends on the salt, you know, the
You had the same
contents of the water.
characteristics as the flat sheet membranes. You got better rejection of the divalent ions.
Right, absolutely.
The
4%.
B5 rejected the divalent ions pretty good, but not sodium chloride. But the B9 really was a vast improvement in rejecting the sodium chloride ions.
As the spiral developed, you were, I would assume, watching its development closely. And at some point, did it appear to the Permacept folks that this was a sincere challenge to you? Because you had a pretty dominant market position in the late 60s,
I
early 70s.
think the Yuma project was where things really came to a head in that project, because there was a lot of research done at Yuma between Hydronautics, UOP, and Dupont. And I guess we felt like our membrane performed the best, that we had the original membranes in there from day one and they stayed in the whole time. Whereas UOP and Hydronautics continually changed out their membranes. Then when the bid came, Dupont was left out not on the bids, but on accepting of the bids. We were totally left out. I think Hydronautics got one of them got 20%, the other got 80% of the business, and Dupont got nothing. And all the technical work basically came out to be a wash. In other words, they didn't really evaluate. It all got down to economics. And so at that point, I think there was a big change in the way people perceive things.
We didn't do a very good job on spirals.
Why was that, do you think? I mean, you certainly had the chemistry.
We tried to invent everything ourselves. We came up with the B15 membrane based on the polyaramid. It's highly sulfonated, and there were a number of things. We coated it up in Towanda, and the guy who was the research guy wanted to be successful, and when he tested the membrane, he took out all the he had a cation exchange unit, and he ended up taking out all the magnesium and calcium to get his results, so he got good salt rejection. But yet when you put it in the field, all of a sudden what we got in our cell tests didn't correspond to what we got when we put it in the field when the calcium magnesium was present. The other thing is, because it was sulfonated, the membrane compacted, and so when you rolled it up like in a jelly roll in a spiral, now all of a sudden what was a membrane that was 7 mils thick or whatever, I can't remember the numbers, now became like 5 mils thick. So now all of a sudden you got this slop in a spiral cartridge, and the cartridge wouldn't work very well.
The question that everybody asks is that DuPont, having spent a lot of time and years and money achieving a position which at one time was dominant in the industry, decides to go away. Why was that decision made, do you know?
Well, I think we just told you they wanted to sell the nylon business in Waynesboro.
Well, I think it's also economics. You know, DuPont gets concerned about the businesses making money. Permacept business was a $10 or $20 million business. I mean, that's like a grain of sand on a beach. We were nothing to DuPont. Yeah. It wasn't worth the headache. Permacept was a unique business. It wasn't a typical DuPont business. It was like a little entrepreneurial business. And I remember we used to have meetings. We'd have a project would come up, and we would be called into the a conference room. The marketing people would be there, the manufacturing people would be there, the technical people would be there. And we'd be there, how can we win this project? We have to win this project. We can't keep cutting costs. What can we do? Technical people, what can you do to push the limits of the technology as far as what's acceptable? What you can do to, how far you can push salt passage, how far you can extend the life of the membrane, how far you can push conversion and things like that. So we were constantly trying to improve things like how far could we go with scaling. We used a Stiffen-Davis index for calcium carbonate control versus, say, the Langolier index, which was for brackish water. That allowed us to operate at higher pH, use less pH, or less acid in the plants. So that would save operating cost for the customer. So we would do things like that to try to cut our cost. And how can manufacturing, what can you do to boost the flow rate of the permeators up? How can you get a little extra fiber in or a little more productivity out of the units? How can you improve salt passage? Things like that. And all together like that, we'd sit there and go through these meetings, and we would come up with a project and cut the cost and win projects.
I think one thing that happened is that once we got into the spiral wound, it tended to dilute our efforts. Yeah. And instead of remaining focused on our original product, it diluted the efforts, and yet it didn't We didn't have the technical support for all of everything. So obviously, that was not a very good thing